I was 18. Young. Curious. Caught between the innocence of childhood and the temptations of adulthood. I had my first real job, a simple one, taking care of a little girl while her parents worked. But what started as just a job became something I never should have allowed. I crossed a line. A line that should never be crossed. A married man. A father. Someone I was supposed to respect, to see as a boss, a father figure, a protector. But in the end, I wasn't just a nanny. I became his secret. And the worst part? I let it happen. A part of me still wonders, if I could go back, would I change it? Would I walk away before it all spiraled out of control? Or was I always meant to carry this weight? This is my story. A story of betrayal, guilt, and a secret I have never been able to forget. Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of temptation, secrecy, and the consequences of forbidden choices. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop listening now. But if you stay, I promise you this, by the end of this story, you will see things differently. When I took the job, I thought it was just a simple way to earn money. A stepping stone. I had no idea it would change me forever. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and desperate for independence. My family wasn't poor, but we were never comfortable. My mom worked long hours at a diner, and my dad, well, I barely knew him. He left when I was little, popping in and out of my life just enough to remind me that he was never really there. I learned early on that men had a way of disappearing. College wasn't in the cards for me, at least not right away. I needed money. Stability. And when I saw the ad for a nanny position, it felt like a perfect fit, decent pay, steady hours, and a chance to be around a child. I always liked kids. They were simple. Honest. Unlike adults, they didn't hide their feelings behind polite smiles and empty words. When I arrived at the Klein house for my interview, I remember thinking I had stepped into a world that didn't belong to me. The house was huge, modern but warm, the kind of place where everything felt expensive without trying too hard. The floors gleamed, the walls were covered in tasteful artwork, and the air smelled like fresh flowers and coffee. It was the kind of life I had only ever seen in movies. And then Addison Klein greeted me at the door. She was beautiful, the kind of woman who looked effortlessly put together. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek bun, her makeup was subtle but flawless, and she wore a crisp white blouse that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She was polite. Sweet, even. She asked about my experience with kids, my schedule, my plans for the future. And when she smiled, it was genuine. She wasn't just hiring a nanny, she was trusting me with her daughter. Seven Klein was only 2 years old, tiny, with big brown eyes and wild curls that bounced when she laughed. She was shy at first, clinging to her mother's leg, but within minutes, she warmed up to me. By the time Addison led me through the house, explaining Seven's schedule and showing me where everything was, I knew I wanted the job. And then I met Atlas Klein. He walked in halfway through the interview, fresh out of the shower, hair damp, wearing just gray sweatpants and a fitted t-shirt. His presence filled the room before he even spoke. And when he did speak? His voice was deep, smooth, with just the right amount of warmth. He introduced himself with a firm handshake, his palm warm, strong, lingering just a second longer than necessary. He didn't look like I had imagined. When I heard doctor, I pictured someone older, maybe balding, with tired eyes and a serious face. But Atlas? He was young for his profession, probably mid-30s, tall, broad shoulders, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He had the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. Not just attractive, but commanding. The kind of man who could walk into a room and make people listen without saying a word. I told myself I wasn't attracted to him. That it was just admiration, curiosity. And maybe at first, that was true. But looking back, maybe I was lying to myself. From the outside, Atlas and Addison seemed perfect. The kind of couple you see in holiday commercials, smiling, effortlessly in sync. But when you looked closer, the cracks were there. Subtle things. The way Addison's voice turned tight when she reminded him about his hospital shifts. The way Atlas's jaw clenched when she talked about weekend plans without consulting him. The polite, distant kisses. The rehearsed smiles. I told myself it was none of my business. And for a while, I believed that. At first, my job was simple. I arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, just as Addison was rushing out the door for work. Atlas was usually asleep when I got there, exhausted from overnight hospital shifts. Some mornings, he wasn't even home yet. But on the days he was? That's when things started to change. It was small at first. I'd be in the kitchen making Seven breakfast, and he'd walk in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, shirtless, his sweatpants hanging low on his hips. I tried not to look. But I did. And the worst part? I think he knew. Because soon, it wasn't just casual appearances. One morning, I caught him watching me as I bent down to pick up Seven's toy. His gaze lingered, just for a second, but long enough to send a shiver down my spine. Another time, he stood behind me at the sink, reaching past me to grab a glass, his arm brushing against mine, his breath warm against my neck. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was reading into things that weren't there. But the longer I worked there, the more I felt it. The shift. The unspoken tension. And then, one morning, everything changed. It started with small things. Harmless things. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Atlas wasn't shy about walking around half-dressed. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, this was his home. If he wanted to walk around shirtless, that was his right. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. Some mornings, I'd walk into the kitchen, and he'd be standing there, leaning against the counter, wearing nothing but boxers and a smirk. His body was toned, his chest broad, his abs tight, and his presence commanding in a way that made it impossible to look away. I tried to act like it didn't affect me. Like I didn't notice the way he moved, the way his muscles tensed when he reached for something, the way his eyes flickered to me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. But I did notice. And it wasn't just him. Something inside me shifted. I started caring more about how I looked before I left for work. Instead of throwing on jeans and a hoodie, I found myself reaching for tighter shorts, skirts that hit just above my knee, tops that hugged my body in all the right places. It wasn't on purpose. At least, that's what I told myself. I wasn't flirting. I wasn't inviting anything. I was just playing along. Or maybe I was testing him. Maybe I wanted to see if he'd notice me the way I noticed him. And then, one morning, everything changed. It was early. Addison had already left for work, and Atlas was sleeping off a long night shift. Seven had been fussy all morning, crying for her father, pulling at my hand, begging to see him. I hesitated. I never went into his room. That was his space. But Seven wouldn't stop crying, and I didn't want to wake him by knocking. So I opened the door. And I saw him. At first, I thought he was asleep. The blankets were kicked down to his waist, his bare chest rising and falling with each slow breath. His head was tilted back, his jaw slack, his hand, oh. His hand. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I should have turned around. I should have walked out before he saw me. But I didn't. I stared. It was only for a second, maybe two. But in that moment, time stopped. And then his eyes opened. His gaze locked onto mine, his body going rigid, his hands snapping away. Seven tugged at my arm, pulling me forward. I barely managed to drop her onto the bed before I spun around and rushed out of the room, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to think. I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. I felt something else. Minutes passed. Maybe more. I was in the living room, staring at the floor, my face burning. And then I heard his footsteps. I looked up. Atlas stood in the doorway, wearing sweatpants now, but still shirtless. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not embarrassed, just knowing. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice low, casual. Too casual. I shook my head quickly, forcing out a nervous laugh. "No, it's fine. It's your house. You can do whatever you want." He didn't say anything. Just watched me. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between us. It was the first time I let myself wonder, was this really an accident? Or was I meant to see? The next morning, when I arrived at the house, something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but there was a weight in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I walked in quietly, expecting to find Atlas asleep. The house was silent. But then I heard it. A sound coming from his room. The door was half open. I knew what I was hearing. He knew I had arrived. He knew I was standing outside his door, just a few steps away. But he didn't stop. I felt my pulse quicken. I knew what was happening. I knew that if I stepped forward, if I pushed that door open, everything would change. And then, I heard my name. Mara. A whisper. A summon. I hesitated. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I stepped inside. "Mara." His voice was low, rough. Not a command, not a plea, just a single word, hanging in the air like a challenge. I should have turned around. The room was dim, the only light coming from the half-open curtains. The sheets were messy, his body partially covered, his skin flushed. Atlas didn't move. He didn't reach for me. He just watched. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was something in it, something dark, something dangerous. Something I couldn't walk away from. I took another step. And just like that, the line disappeared. I don't remember how it started. Or maybe I do, but I've told myself the details don't matter. I remember his hand, warm, firm, pulling me closer. I remember my breath catching in my throat, my body locking up as his fingers traced the curve of my hip. I remember the heat of his skin against mine, the way his touch sent a shiver down my spine. I was nervous. Terrified. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. He must have noticed, because his grip softened, his lips barely brushing against my. Before he eased in further, his grip on my hips tightening. The pain faded, replaced by something new. A pressure. A fullness. A heat that spread through me so fast it left me dizzy. Atlas moved slowly at first, then faster, his breath ragged, his body pressing against mine in a way that felt inevitable. Like this was always supposed to happen. Like there was no other ending but this. And when it was over. When his body finally stilled, his chest rising and falling against mine, his hand still tangled in my hair. I didn't feel regret. Not yet. We didn't speak at first. Atlas lay beside me, one arm draped over his forehead, staring at the ceiling like he was trying to process what just happened. I should have felt different. I should have felt changed, transformed. Instead, I felt numb. Like my body hadn't caught up with my mind yet. Atlas was the first to move. He reached over to the bedside table, grabbed his wallet, and pulled out a few bills. "Here." I blinked. "For the morning after pill," he said. His voice was even, emotionless, like he was discussing a routine errand. I took the money, my fingers shaking slightly. I don't know what I expected. A kiss? A lingering touch? Some kind of acknowledgement that something had just changed between us? But Atlas was already getting up. Already moving on. "You should go, before 7 wakes up." And just like that, it was over. I told myself it was a mistake. A one-time thing. I went home that night, stood in the shower until the water turned cold, and convinced myself that nothing had to change. That no one had to know. But I did. And so did Atlas. The next morning, when I arrived at the house, he barely looked at me. Addison kissed him goodbye, handed 7 to me, and left for work like nothing had happened. And for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe I had read too much into it. But then, Atlas brushed past me in the hallway. His fingers grazed my hip, just barely, just enough to send a shock through me. And when I looked up, he was already walking away. Like it was nothing. Like it was a game. And suddenly, I realized, I didn't want it to be over. It didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. At first, it was stolen touches. A hand on my waist when he passed by. A knowing look across the room. A whispered word that meant nothing but felt like everything. And then it became more. More risks. More danger. Atlas found ways to be alone with me. A quick moment in the laundry room, his hands trailing up my thighs. A whispered "meet me upstairs" when Addison was on the phone. And I let it happen. Every time, I told myself it was the last. And every time, I went back. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about the secrecy. The thrill. The way it made me feel wanted, powerful, reckless. And I had never felt that before. But what I didn't realize then, what I refused to see, was that secrets don't stay hidden forever. And we were already running out of time. It ended the way all things like this do, without ceremony, without warning. One day, I was his secret. The next, I was nothing. It started with small changes. Subtle, but impossible to ignore. Atlas stopped lingering in the mornings. He used to find reasons to be near me, standing too close in the kitchen, brushing his hand against mine when no one was looking. But suddenly, he wasn't there. When I arrived, he was already gone. If he was home, he was locked in his office or sleeping until noon, barely acknowledging my presence. At first, I convinced myself it was just a phase. Maybe he was tired from work. Maybe Addison had noticed something, and he was trying to be careful. But then, he stopped touching me altogether. No more stolen moments. No more whispered, "come upstairs." Just distance. A growing, suffocating silence between us. And that's when I realized, I was already being erased. One afternoon, Addison came home early, a rare thing for her. She was excited, practically glowing as she sat across from me at the kitchen table. "I have great news," she said, reaching for my hand like we were old friends. "We finally found a daycare for 7. It's perfect, small class sizes, great teachers. She starts next week." I smiled. Nodded. Said all the things I was supposed to say. But inside, I felt sick. Next week. That was it. My time in this house was over. That night, I lay awake in bed, my stomach twisting. I wanted to believe he would say something. That he would find me, tell me this wasn't over. But the next morning? Atlas avoided me. He barely looked at me. Didn't say a word. And suddenly, I saw it clearly. I had been fooling myself. I had spent months tangled in a fantasy, convincing myself I was special, that what we had meant something. But it didn't. Not to him. To him, I was just an indulgence. A distraction. Something to be discarded the moment it became inconvenient. The shame hit me all at once. I had let myself believe I mattered. I had risked everything, my self-respect, my sanity, for a man who would never leave his wife. I felt disgusting. Stupid. I hated him. But I hated myself more. On my last day, I was packing up 7's toys when Atlas walked in. For the first time in weeks, he really looked at me. "Come upstairs." His voice was calm, unreadable. I followed him. Like an idiot. Like I always did. The door shut behind me. I stood near the bed, the same bed where he had once made me feel wanted, adored. Now, I felt nothing but emptiness. Atlas reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope, setting it on the dresser. "This is for you," he said. "For everything." I didn't move. "For what?" I asked, my voice hollow. "For your time. For helping with 7. I stared at the envelope. I already knew what was inside. Cash. Like I was some employee finishing a job. Like that was all I had ever been. I forced out a bitter laugh. "Is this hush money?" Atlas's jaw tightened. "It's just a thank you, Mara. That's all. A thank you. Not an apology. Not regret. Just a transaction." I finally understood. I was never a weakness to him. Never a temptation too strong to resist. I was just something to pass the time. And now, time was up. Atlas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked almost tired. "You'll be fine, Mara." His voice was soft, almost kind. But that made it worse. "You'll move on." That was it. No goodbye. No second thoughts. Just a simple, effortless dismissal. And then, he walked out of the room. I followed slowly, my legs unsteady. Down the stairs. Past the kitchen. Through the front door. I turned back one last time. Atlas was already inside, his arm wrapped around Addison's waist as she laughed at something he said. Their daughter giggled, clapping her tiny hands. And just like that. It was like I had never been there at all. I wish I could say I walked away and never looked back. That I erased him from my mind the second I stepped out of that house. But that would be a lie. Atlas stayed with me. In my thoughts. In my body. In the quiet, empty moments when I was alone. Not with love. Not even with hate. But with something worse. A mix of shame, regret, and a craving I couldn't understand. I never told anyone. Not my mother. Not my friends. No one. How could I? How do you admit something like that? That you let yourself become someone's secret. That you convinced yourself you were special, only to realize you were just a passing thrill. That you let a married man take pieces of you, your innocence, your trust, your body, then discard you like you were nothing. The shame was unbearable. It sank into my bones, weighed me down in ways I never could have imagined. And the worst part? It didn't go away. Time passed. I moved on, or at least, I tried to. New jobs. New cities. New men. But none of it mattered. Because no matter where I went, no matter who I was with, Atlas was still there. Lurking in the back of my mind, like a shadow that never fully disappears. I would catch myself thinking about him at the strangest moments. Folding laundry. Waiting in line at the grocery store. Lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. And when I did, I hated myself all over again. Because he probably never thought about me. I was a mistake he had left in the past. A secret buried beneath his perfect life. But me? I still carried him. Even when I didn't want to. Looking back, I've tried to make sense of it. To figure out why I let it happen. And the truth? It wasn't love. It was power. Control. An escape from reality, from responsibility, from the dullness of routine. Atlas wasn't some tragic, love-struck man torn between duty and desire. He was selfish. And so was I. Because that's what infidelity really is. It's not about romance. It's not about passion. It's about taking something because you want it, no matter the cost. And the cost? It's never worth it. Because no one truly wins in betrayal. Someone always carries the burden. And sometimes, that burden never goes away. I wish I could say time healed it. That the guilt faded, that I became a different person, that I found a way to let it all go. But some mistakes don't just disappear. Some choices follow you, even when you try to outrun them. There are nights I wake up, drenched in sweat, my body still reacting to memories I wish I could erase. And there are days, quiet, unremarkable days, when his name slips into my thoughts, uninvited, unwelcome. I don't love him. I don't even miss him. But I think about him. And that's the worst part. Because he probably never thinks about me. He wakes up beside his wife every morning. He kisses his daughter on the forehead before heading to work. He sits at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, laughing, living his life as if I never existed. And me? I live with the weight of a secret that only I carry. A secret that will always belong to me and me alone. Have you ever done something you knew was wrong, but couldn't stop yourself? What happens when your biggest mistake becomes the one thing you can never forget? Let me know in the comments. Your stories matter. And if this made you think, if this made you feel something, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because some stories deserve to be told. Even the ones we wish we could bury.